Tyrannosaurus rex is the most iconic dinosaur ever. One might be keen to revise that statement to most iconic non-avian dinosaur ever, because certainly many avian dinosaurs might outclass the Tyrant lizard king in popularity. We eat chickens every day after all. Whatever the case, the big beefy boy of the latest Cretaceous has been in our minds tearing apart the carcasses of hapless herbivorous dinosaurs since it was first unveiled to the world in 1905. Ever since, the dinosaur has been under constant surveillance from all angles, to the point at which it is easily the most studied fossil species. As such, its history as a fossil species has been topsy-turvy, with all sorts of changes. A brand new change, published in March 2022, finds that the bones of Tyrannosaurus rex show enough differences to warrant splitting up the species Tyrannosaurus rex into three: Tyrannosaurus rex, Tyrannosaurus imperator, and Tyrannosaurus regina. Let's get into it. What is a species? Well, the species designation is the basic unit of classification of an organism. It's traditionally, and sometimes basically, defined as the largest group of organisms in which any two individuals of the appropriate sex or mating types can produce fertile offspring. In other words, a species is any group of critters that are capable of interbreeding and creating offspring that can also breed. I say traditionally because the species concept is made up and doesn't fit with reality. It's great for bookkeeping and data, but doesn't always reflect the reality of the plastic genes that are shaped by the environment. For example, what about animals that are not the same species but are closely related and have been known to interbreed to create offspring? Sometimes these hybrids do produce viable offspring, but most often create sterile hybrids. This is one of the points where the species concept breaks down. Hybrids between closely related but distinct species is also a process of evolution. That is, sometimes new species evolve due to the hybridization of other species. Now, what about species in the fossil record? As realistically useless as the species concept is for living things, it is even more so for fossil species. Unlike living animals, for which we can gather soft tissue, genetic, and anatomical data, fossil species are based mostly on just anatomical data gleaned from incomplete bones. Obviously, special fossils can provide even more data, but those are rare, so you can't count on them. This all means that applying species designations to fossil animals is just bookkeeping. They don't truly reflect a species as we understand it in living animals. This is because any given fossil species comes from an extremely small sample size from an extremely specific region and rock layer. Sometimes sample sizes of extinct species are large enough and come from enough of the same rock layers that differences between specimens can be effectively applied to differences between species. This has caused many a problem with how to define paleospecies over the last 2 centuries. For example, some dinosaur genera have had tens of species applied to them, a la Triceratops, while slight differences more applicable to individual variation within a single species have been given new genus or species names. That's how we ended up with Trachodon, Anatosaurus, Clausosaurus, and Anatotitan to the real valid Edmontosaurus. Now, moving our magnifying glass to the most famous dinosaur ever, Tyrannosaurus, We'll see that it too has gone through some debate as to how many species really belong to the Tyrannosaurus genus. The main thing with Tyrannosaurus is that there are some clear differences between the 40+ specimens, but these differences have never really been strong enough to support more than one species under the Tyrannosaurus banner. An Asian genus very closely related to Tyrannosaurus, Tarbosaurus, has also been variously thrown into the Tyrannosaurus box. This one, most researchers find dubious since Tarbosaurus is smaller, less robust, is known from slightly earlier to the same age rocks, and is endemic to Mongolia. We'll forget about Tarbosaurus for now. The major differences between specimens of Tyrannosaurus rex have been their overall anatomy. There are two distinct body types among the specimens. One is larger and more robust, and the other is smaller and skinnier. Plenty of ink has been spilled in describing the precise list of details that distinguish these two morphs from one another, but far less ink has been spilled on trying to find a conclusive answer on what they mean. There are 4 major possible explanations or hypotheses as to what the differences among Tyrannosaurus rex specimens mean. Sexual dimorphism hypothesis. This has been a common possible explanation posed for many decades. Do these major differences reflect differences in the sexes? Sexual dimorphism? Then who is the female and who is the male? That would be almost impossible to substantiate given how difficult it is to designate sex in the skeletons of animals as alien to us as non-avian dinosaurs. It can be done, and has been done. It's also been done on Tyrannosaurus. The leg bone of a robust morph Tyrannosaurus, B. rex, contained preserved medullary bone. Medullary bone being the type of calcium-rich bone that mother birds form as a reserve of calcium for creating the shells to their eggs. The presence of this type of bone in any fossil archosaur would mean they were pregnant females at the time of death. B. rex belongs to the bulkier morph Tyrannosaurus rex, but it's still up in the air if that means all bulky rexes were female, or if this was just the female of a bulky rex morph. Some researchers were so confident in their sexual dimorphism hypothesis for these tyrant morphs that they went out and stated that perhaps the larger, more robust morphs were male, while the slender ones were female. I don't know why any of these researchers ever thought this was anything more than pure speculation, but it has been bandied about for quite some time. Ontogenetic variation hypothesis. It's also possible these differences could be ontogenetic, or a consequence of age as the young gracile Tyrannosauruses matured into huge, beefy powerhouses. This hypothesis suggests that perhaps Tyrannosaurus rex went from a gracile stage of life to a robust stage. Individual variation hypothesis. The third explanation is that maybe all these differences only amount to the natural genetic differences between individuals. These animals had a higher form of genetic diversity than our species. We are special in that regard. We see plenty of variability within our own skeletons, let alone soft tissues, so perhaps that's just what's happening here. Multiple species hypothesis. These morphs could be separate species of Tyrannosaurus. Some morphs come from slightly different times and different regions of North America, and the Tyrannosaurus genus lasted for 1 to 2 million years, depending on who you ask and what fossils and rocks you cite. This length of time is similar to the length of time it took for the lion and leopard to diverge. Obviously, speciation can occur many times over in even a geologically short period of time as 1 to 2 million years. Plenty of researchers expect there to have been many species of Tyrannosaurus in the time between its divergence from other tyrannosaurs and its extinction 66 million years ago. So perhaps the differences really do reflect this expected reality. A brand new study published in March 2022 by paleoartist and author Gregory S. Paul, Dr. Scott Persons of the University of Alberta and College of Charleston, and mathematical prodigy, rock star, and College of Charleston alum J. Van Raalte in the Journal of Evolutionary Biology, set out to provide support for the hypothesis that there were multiple species of Tyrannosaurus throughout the span of late Cretaceous North America. The paper. So the paper starts off by talking about the obvious visual differences between the robust and gracile morphs within the sample size of known Tyrannosaurus rex specimens. Obviously, this is not scientific, but illustrative. Specifically, the authors singled out the femur bones as a measure of how robust a specimen is. They note that the robustness of the femur positively correlates with robustness of the overall skeleton. So studying the robustness of the femur is a good measure as to what morph a specimen is. This is good because it can allow the analysis to include more specimens that may not have enough bones preserved. In their study, the researchers used a sample size of 38 specimens labeled Tyrannosaurus rex. They measured or compiled the measurements of the maxilla, dentary, humerus, ilia, femora, and metatarsal bones. They found that the bigger and more robust the overall skeleton was, the bigger and thicker the femur would be. This is because the femur is the bone which has to hold up the entire bulk of the body and survive the brunt of the force. Therefore, a larger, heavier Tyrannosaurus needs a larger femur. They then used clustering algorithms to divide the femur measurements and ratios into the robust and gracile morphs. The second major characteristic they used to designate robust and gracile morphs were the teeth, specifically the incisiform-like teeth at the very front of the lower jaw, or dentary. Turns out that the amount, dimensions, and arrangement of these toothers correlates with the femur robustness and the different Tyrannosaurus morphs overall. Based on their analysis, the primitive condition for the incisiform teeth at the tip of the lower jaw seems to be of a two-tooth setup. This two-tooth setup occurs throughout the known record of Tyrannosaurus. The second tooth condition is of a one-tooth setup. This condition occurs exclusively in higher, younger layers of rock alongside the two-tooth setup. Therefore, the team suggested the one-tooth setup is a newer, more advanced adaptation. The robust morph with the robust femur also has two incisiform teeth, while the slender morph with the slender femur has one tooth. They also noted that the correlation between slender morph and single incisiform tooth isn't clear-cut, and that there are some robust morph Tyrannosauruses from the very end of the Cretaceous with a borderline condition. Their conclusion is that there are three major morphotypes among the many specimens given the name Tyrannosaurus rex. They note that their data is not ideal. It does not ideally prove any of the four hypotheses on the Tyrannosaur morphs. The team found that the data does, however, significantly favor one hypothesis over the other: the multiple species hypothesis. They think it's speciation because the robust morphs outnumber the gracile morphs 2-to-1. Theoretically, there should be equal number of morphs if they were representative of sexual dimorphism. It also doesn't make sense for the ontogeny hypothesis, since not many animals ever make it to the largest and oldest sizes to then get fossilized, but the largest, most robust morphs are overrepresented in the sample size. Based on stratigraphy, the authors of the new paper found that the robustness of the femurs in the robust Tyrannosaurus morphs match better with that of Tarbosaurus. The robust morph is older than the slender morph, which makes sense for its similarity to Tarbosaurus. The authors suggest that the slender morph was a more recent development within the Tyrannosaurus genus, which appeared during the latter half of Tyrannosaurus evolution. So, what do the differences in bones and their correlation to morphs mean for these new species of Tyrannosaurus? Morphotype 1. The lowest in the stratigraphic record, the oldest. It is the most primitive form of Tyrannosaurus, with robust proportions, usually with two distinct incisiform teeth in the lower jaw. Morphotype 2. Another robust form that appears higher or earlier than Morphotype 1. It has one incisiform dentary tooth or a borderline condition between 2 and 1 teeth. Morphotype 3. This is the gracile morph with only one tooth in the jaw. It is also stratigraphically higher than Morphotype 1. The author team think these differences are too subtle to warrant naming new genera. but are too distinct for them to all represent variation within a single species over time. Therefore, their conclusion was to name 2 new species of Tyrannosaurus, in addition to Tyrannosaurus rex. The oldest, Morphotype 1, has now been given the name Tyrannosaurus imperator, imperator being Latin for emperor. This is now the Tyrant lizard emperor. The team designated FNMH PR2081, or SU, as the holotype of this new species. Tyrannosaurus imperator is distinguished as the oldest, most robust species with a 2-tooth setup. Other specimens placed in this new species include Fox the Tyrannosaurus, or BHI 4182, BHI 6231, E.D. Cope, or BHI 6248. One of the very few on display in Europe, Tristan Otto, or HMN MBR 91216, the pregnant one, B-Rex, or MOR 1125, G-Rex, or MOR 1128, the other European one, Trex, or RGM 792, the Mud Butte T-Rex, or SDSM 12047, the one on display at the Children's Museum of Indianapolis, Bucky, or TCM 2001-91, TMT V2222, and possibly the fragmentary bits of the Elephant Butte Tyrannosaurus from New Mexico, NMNNH P3698. Tyrannosaurus rex was left as just Morphotype 2. Its holotype specimen remains the original holotype specimen of Tyrannosaurus rex, CM9340. This is the specimen found by Barnum Brown back in 1902 and named by American Museum of Natural History paleontologist Henry Fairfield Osborn in 1905. This means that this species of Tyrannosaurus is of robust proportions, with 2 to 1 tooth in the dentary bone, or some borderline condition. The team also applied a bunch of other traditionally Tyrannosaurus rex specimens to this original species designation. A bunch of specimens found and owned by the Black Hills Institute, Y-Rex, the one without the end of its tail, or BHI 6230, as well as BHI 6233, 6435, and 6436. Possibly Duffy, or BHBI 4100. One of the largest specimens, Scotty, or RSM 2523.8. And the one found before Tyrannosaurus rex was even a name, MNHUK R7994. The youngest, Morphotype 3, has now been given the name Tyrannosaurus regina, regina being Latin for queen, making this species the Tyrant lizard queen. This species is the gracile morph once thought to represent a female of the Tyrannosaurus rex species. It also has the single-tooth setup. The team designated USNM 555000 Winkle Rex, or the nation's T-Rex, as the holotype of Tyrannosaurus regina. They also gave the name to the now lost to science Stan, or EXBHI 3033, the big scary one at the Museum of the Rockies, Pex Rex, Rigby Rex, or MOR 980, the old juvenile or subadult LACM 23485, LL 12823, and the reclined pitch black Black Beauty TMP 81.6.1. Now that everything has been laid out, what possible explanation is there for 3 species? In the time before the latest stage of the late Cretaceous, North America was cleaved in two by the dagger of ocean known as the Western Interior Seaway. This shallow inland sea divided the continent and its biological diversity, forcing animals into areas with smaller overall resources. This supported animals usually only up to the size range of modern rhinos. This reflects what is known of the fossil record during this period. Tyrannosaurs were about half to a third the size of Tyrannosaurus, and hunted down ceratopsians half the size of Triceratops. Sometimes 2 Tyrannosaur genera would share the same region, but likely preyed upon different sets of animals. The smaller Asian cousin of Tyrannosaurus, Tarbosaurus, may have been the ancestor to Tyrannosaurus itself. If not directly Tarbosaurus, then perhaps an unknown species of Tyrannosaurus, or even the newly proposed Tyrannosaurus imperator. The team suggests that Tyrannosaurus imperator, or an Asian ancestor, conquered North American territories through a land bridge between Asia and North America, before speciating into the distinct gracile and robust species of the latest late Cretaceous. This invasion of Asian tyrannosaurs coincided with the retreat of the Western Interior Seaway, opening up of a much larger region of resources and ballooning of dinosaurian sizes throughout the continent. Tyrannosaurus was joined by Ankylosaurus, Edmontosaurus, Alamosaurus, Triceratops, and Torosaurus as some of the largest of their respective groups. The diversification of the Tyrannosaurus imperator species into Tyrannosaurus regina and Rex may have reflected ecological diversification, as the ecosystems of late Cretaceous North America saw greater overall diversification in fauna. The research team, perhaps prematurely, speculate that the robust species kept the adaptations of the older robust species to hunt down the usual big-bodied prey, while the gracile species adapted to prey upon smaller, less armored animals. The response. Now we come to the cons of this paper. I don't want to personally attack the main author, Gregory S. Paul, because the vast majority of researchers, including myself, have a lot of respect for the guy. On top of being an excellent artist, partially responsible for propelling dinosaur renaissance ideas of dinosaurs into the public consciousness in the 80s and 90s, he's a rather studious independent paleontologist as well. His books populate many a paleontologist library and contain tomes worth of information. That being said, Gregory S. Paul is a strange one when it comes to the hypotheses of lumping or splitting dinosaur taxa. To lump is to group together specimens under the same banner, and splitting is the opposite. Some researchers are splitters when they perceive even the most subtle differences as indicative of a separate species, while the lumper conjoins all specimens even remotely similar together. Paul is known for his unorthodox and often incorrect lumping of fossil species into the same genus. Most of his examples come from his Princeton field guides. For example, he's the guy who lumped the North American Deinonychus anteripus into the Velociraptor genus in the late 1980s, thus making the North American animal Velociraptor anteripus. Now, Paul has gone on the record as no longer accepting his older hypothesis, but this is not the only case. He lumps the Zimbabwe theropod Megapnosaurus into the North American Coelophysis genus, Aucasaurus into Abelisaurus, and the miniature Alaskan Nanuqsaurus, the lightly built Teratophonius, and Tarbosaurus into the Tyrannosaurus genus, despite a wide range in time, anatomy, and geography. I will add one more thing I found funny. In his most recent Princeton Field Guide to Dinosaurs edition, he did not lump Alioramus and Chianchausaurus together, despite how other researchers have proposed this. I just find that a little funny. All that said, most of his ideas are sound or align with the evidence, and I don't think his unorthodox genus lumping inherently makes him a bad researcher. It's just good to highlight biases. Suffice it to say, the vast majority of paleontologists, Tyrannosaur expert or not, disagree with the naming of new Tyrannosaurus species based solely on parameters outlined in this paper. Thomas Carr, Tyrannosaur expert and paleontologist at Carthage College, stated that the evidence in this paper to prove their case was vanishingly weak. Carr said another concern was that the study included specimens from privately owned or commercial outfits, affecting the ability of researchers to reproduce the results. Perhaps most damning is the fact that the authors were unable to refer several excellent skulls to any of the three species, Carr said. If their species are valid, then more than just two features should identify them. Nearly every detail, especially in the head, should be different. Thomas Holt stated that it's a testable hypothesis, as any statement of species identity should be. With additional new specimens, we can see if specimens they didn't include, or we haven't found yet, are consistent with this suggestion, or if they reject it. Holtz figures that the data provided by Paul and team would be more convincing if they were organized more chronologically in specific layers of rocks, since the Hell Creek Formation contains a bunch of smaller layers of rocks, with other dinosaur species showing other examples of species divergence, as what is proposed in Tyrannosaurus. At the same time, in the same place, the same size classes of organisms are going through a succession of species, Dr. Holtz said. It's not inconceivable that Tyrannosaurus did so as well. Jingmei O'Connor, associate curator of fossil reptiles at the Field Museum, suggested that one of the major problems with this study is that the femur proportions for the 3 Tyrannosaurus species overlap rather than show clear separations. O'Connor also noted that the same thing is happening with the periods of time in which the 3 species existed. This would suggest a spectrum of changes as the Tyrannosaurus rex species evolved from older to younger rocks. The diagnoses provided for each species are incredibly vague, using words like usually and generally. Dr. O'Connor said, "Even in well-preserved specimens, the authors are unable to refer them to a specific species." O'Connor brings up a major issue I find with the paper: its informality, structure, format, and word choice. Obviously, it doesn't invalidate the data collected, but the paper is structured incredibly confusingly. I genuinely don't know how some of it got through peer review. For one, this diagram here showing all the skeletons and morphs of Tyrannosaurus. A tweet by fellow paleoartists and independent researcher Jamie Hayden states, "A classic of extensive, messy figures is the involuted and outright incoherent way they are labeled. We typically write labels the way we read, so the eye naturally expects the A first, the B next, and so forth. We don't get this in Paul and Others 2022. This is true. Take a look. The skeletons are labeled B, then A, E, D, C, and then F. They are also not organized into the morphotypes, so that the reader could group them together to see the similarities and differences." Paleoartist and researcher John Conway also noted that he hates the ABCD way of labeling figures at all, and I have to agree. It clears everything up when you have a label next to every single figure in a paper. That may take up more room, so it may be more of a restriction imposed by the journal publisher rather than the authors, but it's still a thing that should be changed. I would have organized it like this. All skeletons are in a single column with the imperator, rex, and regina skeletons grouped together. I would have also placed a label next to each skeleton or a big one underneath the column. Aside from that, there are 2 illustrated figures showing femur robustness and tooth count, when there should have been an entire album of photographs showing these anatomical differences. The formatting for the systematic paleontology section, wherein the authors named the new species, is horrid. I've seen some other people have to highlight or change the color of the text for each designation, so as to be able to tell where one begins and the other ends. Looks more like something that would be sent via fax or was typed on a typewriter. I find it kind of odd to provide a table that is just a series of arguments and evidence for and against the multiple Tyrannosaurus species, but that's just me. Like, I have read a lot of papers and never seen it done like this, but I guess it is up to the author's discretion. I just think it could have been shortened into a pros and cons section. Steve Brussati, a paleontologist at the University of Edinburgh, who was just a co-author on the Scottish pterosaur Yark, said he was not convinced. "I understand the temptation to divide T-Rex into different species, because there is some variation in the fossil bones that we have. But ultimately, to me, this variation is very minor and not indicative of meaningful biological separation of distinct species that can be defined based on clear, explicit, consistent differences." Denver Fowler of the Dickinson Museum Center and Badlands Dinosaur Museum tweeted that he agreed with some of the data in the study, particularly the tooth data. Fowler wants to see a full stratigraphic justification for the species split beyond what is included in the paper's supplementary materials. Fowler goes on to propose histology studies for the project. Histology is the study of microscopic tissues within hard and soft tissues. This is usually done by slicing the specimen into super thin chips, gluing them to a microscope slide, and then looking at them under the microscope for any data that may be present. One of the best ways to help further quantify the three species hypothesis would be to cut into the femurs of each specimen of Tyrannosaurus used in the study. It would be even better to do this with every specimen of Tyrannosaurus publicly available. With this process, researchers can look for growth rings to provide a rough estimate of the age of each individual at the time of death. This would go to see if some of the species were actually just different growth stages of the same species. Fowler even went through the trouble of showing the process of cutting out a chunk of femur, making a mold, casting a replica of the chunk you took, fixing up the original bone back to normal for public display, and then slicing and grinding down the chunk you took into an ultra-thin slide for the scope. If the bone was never intended for display, I don't think replacing the chunk with a cast chunk is necessary, so in these cases it's even easier. Gregory S. Paul argues that the new species names are entirely reasonable, and that many dinosaur species are named based on significantly less evidence. If it had been a paper about putting another dinosaur into different species, nobody would really care. This is T-Rex, so people are getting uptight about it. According to the New York Times, Paul also said that if his team had simply published an argument for splitting Tyrannosaurus up without naming the newly created animals, someone else might have been able to swoop in and do so. Which would have been very irritating, he added. I wasn't going to let that happen, so we went ahead and named them. Okay, sounds a little personal to me, but whatever. Dave Hone of the Queen Mary University of London states, Greg Paul says we have named a new species from less traits, maybe, but very rarely. But what we have done is named a new species off few traits when we have very little fossil material, and used traits that we think don't vary a lot between individuals. If one of your two key features is a tooth that we already think varies in other closely related animals, and when you have multiple complete skeletons to work from, that's a massively different situation to working on a partial leg or half a jaw. Dave also stated, pointing out a few different anatomical traits and correlating them with different rock layers could make a decent case for naming new species. But splitting up T-Rex, the most intensively studied and best known dinosaur on Earth, requires a higher standard. If you've got it wrong, it'll be decades of public confusion and argument, which often leads to suggestions that all taxonomic divisions are arbitrary and beloved species don't exist. Worse, it'll be centered on T-Rex, the most famous dinosaur around. That's not the kind of thing you should be doing based on femur robusticity and the presence or absence of a tooth. If you're going to shoot for the king, don't miss. So, what does this all mean? What's the conclusion? Well, this is why this kind of paper, and this paper in particular, is so difficult for science communicators like me. There is no hard answer. The data and analyses conducted by the paper's team are relatively sound and align with what is known and expected of the Tyrannosaurus fossil record. However, their conclusion is too strong for the data they have. I've provided the pros and cons of the research, so I think it speaks for itself. But there were definitely many species of Tyrannosaurus between the evolution of the genus and its extinction 66 million years ago. Whether those species were a direct line of evolution, aka anagenesis, or whether they were offshoots that lived with one another is what needs to be nailed down. I think this study is a great springboard for more studies and more rigorous analyses, covering more specimens and perhaps not those locked behind the gates of private ownership. The 3D models in this video were made by Kuzim, or Adam Midzuk, and the animations were made by Tyler Addison. Their socials will be included in the description and the comment section below. For more interesting stories about nature, the history of life, or what goes bump in the night, subscribe, hit the bell icon for updates, like this video, and drop a comment in the comment section below. Thanks for watching. Special thanks goes to my elephant tier patrons Thea Svensson, Staniforth Hopkins, Dinosaur, Chris Frampton, Biotaverse, Arda Bayer, and Christoph Hubbinger, as well as my Tyrannosaur patrons Iron Bladesman, Henry Brennan, Danny Van Heck, and Dana Manchester.